What is disaster? Disaster means sudden or great misfortune in the English dictionary. Disaster is an important aspect in the field of trauma psychology, as it can be categorized into 3 different agents of destruction. I will walk you through these agents as well as my experience with PTSD and the new therapies being developed. There are natural-made, human-made, and mass violence. First, we'll talk about natural disasters. As we're all familiar, natural disasters include things like floods, earthquakes, and forest fires. These events can negatively impact an individual because they are commonly seen as acts of God and are taken as a personal attack on the self. The second agent of disaster is human-caused disaster, which means that some accident happened because of some other human's carelessness. Examples of this can be seen as train derailments and bridges falling. These disasters are typically most difficult to handle for victims because of the callous nature of the act, along with the possible prolonged litigation. The last agent of disaster is mass violence, which is an event that is characterized by an event that is typically thought of as terrorist attacks. And though they are human-caused, there is a distinct difference between human-caused and disaster and mass violence, and that there is intent to do harm to others. This type of disaster has been on the rise in recent years, and in the United States, with the increase of mass shootings across the nation. Now that I've talked about the agents of disaster that can cause someone to develop PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, we'll discuss why it is important and what can be done to help these people heal. The text, Methods for Disaster Mental Health Research, says that 70% of adults experience at least one traumatic event in their lifetimes, and that upwards of 9% develop PTSD from these events. I know what you're thinking. Isn't it just veterans that experience PTSD from combat? Well, in my past 3 years at Virginia Tech, I have studied the human brain and how it reacts to trauma, and I'm here to tell you that PTSD can affect anyone who experiences any traumatic event. This can include combat, car accidents, sexual assault, and domestic abuse, just to name a few. Following the event, symptoms of PTSD often involve flashbacks and avoidance behaviors. The individual may be experiencing depression and/or anxiety, as those are often comorbid with PTSD. The scary news is that PTSD can affect anyone, but the exciting news is that PTSD is treatable. When individuals who are experiencing symptoms attend therapy, specifically something called prolonged exposure therapy, they can find relief. Prolonged exposure therapy consists of 4 main components of treatment. First, education of reactions to trauma. Second, breathing training. Third is in vivo exposure. And fourth is prolonged imaginal exposure to the traumatic event. Each component is important in helping the individual understand more about themselves and their trauma. First, educating survivors about how the body responds to a traumatic event is helpful because of knowing why your body is making these changes is easier to cope and work through these changes. Breathing encourages an individual to calm their mind while doing mindful tasks and thinking. The in vivo exposure is where victims are encouraged to physically relive their event in some small way that can include revisiting the site of the trauma. Prolonged exposure is where an individual says their story aloud during a therapy session, and then later during the week they listen to that recording while they're at home as like a homework. And this is crucial to the healing process, as PTSD is an illness of the memory. Oftentimes memory is distorted, maybe even out of order, and it is crucial for individuals to retell their story as many times as it takes to be able to get through it without having some type of negative cognition. Because once you can reclaim the memory of your event, you can reclaim your life. In conclusion, PTSD is the disease of the mind and memory that does not discriminate when it comes to its victims. PTSD is not limited to soldiers, but to anyone who experiences a traumatic event, and that can include agents of disaster. Having PTSD or loving someone that has PTSD can be scary, but there is hope for brighter futures for these victims through trusted therapies.
Oh, well done. Well done.
Oh, wrong way.
Hi.
Hey, what's up?
Wait, I don't think
I don't think you got in.
Hi. Hi.
Hello.
Hi, we enjoyed it. Yeah.
That's cool.
cool little rig you got there.
Yeah, gotta get better at using that, but